My mother-in-law's hands started shaking the moment she saw me walk through that door with my daughter beside me, leotard on, wrist wrap in her fist, ready. She grabbed the edge of the front desk, and I watched the color leave her face like someone had pulled a plug. She had made a phone call at 7:30 that morning. She had told the coordinator my 7-year-old would embarrass the family on that floor. What she had not counted on was me finding out before 9 o'clock. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. If stories like this one matter to you, subscribe before we go any further. You'll want to be here for where this ends up. Now, back to that morning and everything that made it possible. The gymnastics center smelled like chalk and floor wax and that particular cold that only exists in big open athletic spaces early in the morning. My daughter Priya had been up since 5:30. She had eaten her breakfast in her leotard. She had asked me 3 times whether her coach would be there, and I had told her yes, every time, because Coach Denise Webb had written the recommendation herself, 2 paragraphs, signed, dated, on official club letterhead. I had that letter on my phone. I had the paid registration confirmation on my phone. I had everything I needed. What I didn't know yet, standing there in that lobby, was that an attorney named Carolyn Gwynn had already sent a letter that would make everything else irrelevant, but I'm getting to that. I need to back up and tell you who these people are, because without that, none of what happened that morning makes any sense. My name is Renata Osei. I am 38 years old. I work as a medical billing specialist for a regional pediatric hospital network. I have for 11 years. My husband, James Osei, and I have been married for 4 years. Priya is my biological daughter from my first marriage. She is 7. She is mine, fully, in every legal and practical sense. Her father has not been in the picture since she was 2, and I have sole custody, documented and court-ordered. James adopted her 18 months after our wedding. His mother, Darlene Osei, is my mother-in-law by marriage. She has no blood connection to me and no legal connection to Priya beyond the family name. That last part matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you. Darlene Osei had decided, somewhere in the first year of our marriage, that she did not approve of Priya's gymnastics. I noticed it before I could name it. There was this moment at a family dinner. Priya had just placed second at a regional invitational. She was 6 years old, and she was so proud she could barely sit still. Darlene had looked at her across the table and said, very pleasantly, "It's a cute hobby. Not congratulations. Not well done. Cute hobby." Priya hadn't caught it. I had. James's family had a specific idea of what their name meant and what activities were appropriate for children who carried it. His older sister's kids played tennis and violin. His cousin's daughter was in a private equestrian program. Gymnastics, competitive gymnastics, chalk on the hands, bruises on the shins, Priya's particular fierce joy of it, did not fit the picture Darlene kept in her head. At one point, about 8 months into our marriage, Darlene pulled me aside after Sunday dinner and told me that the gym fees were a waste of money for a child who would, quote, eventually lose interest. She said it gently, the way people do when they want the advice to land harder than the tone suggests. I told her Priya had been doing gymnastics since she was 4 and had never once asked to stop. Darlene smiled and changed the subject. I filed it away. That was the moment I understood she was not going to say the quiet part out loud, not then, anyway. She would work around the edges. She would phrase things carefully. She would chip away. I had 4 of those moments by then. I was still counting. The first real incident happened about 14 months into our marriage. Priya had a Saturday morning practice, and I was at work. I cover billing audits for our pediatric network, and we were in the middle of a compliance review that had everyone working weekends. James was supposed to take Priya to practice. Darlene had offered to drive, which I thought was fine, a normal grandmother gesture. She took Priya for breakfast instead. Missed the entire practice. Told James that Priya had said she was tired and didn't want to go. Priya was 5 years old. She had told me later, in her 5-year-old way, that Grandma Darlene had said the gym would still be there next week and pancakes sounded better. She hadn't known she was supposed to say no. I understood then that Darlene was perfectly willing to use my daughter's trust to get what she wanted. That was the kind of person she was, not loud about it, not dramatic. Just quietly willing. The second incident was worse. Priya had been selected for an accelerated training track at the club. Coach Denise had identified her as having what she called natural spatial awareness and competitive instinct, which, if you know anything about gymnastics development, is not a small thing for a 6-year-old. The accelerated track cost more. I had already adjusted our budget for it. I had also, separately, started a dedicated savings account for Priya's training and competition fees, just mine, in my name, at my bank. James knew about it. Darlene did not. When Priya was accepted into the track and I mentioned it at a family lunch, Darlene set her fork down, very slowly, and looked at James, not at me. "You're going to let this go on," she said. Not a question. He said, carefully, that Priya was doing well, and he supported the decision. Darlene turned to me then and said, "You're setting that child up for disappointment. Someone has to be realistic." I smiled. I was already 2 steps ahead of where she thought I was. The third incident was the one that changed my calculations entirely. Priya had qualified for state trials. She was 7. Coach Denise had submitted the recommendation herself. She said in 4 years of coaching, she had put forward maybe a handful of kids this age for trials consideration, and Priya was one of them. I had paid the registration fee the same afternoon. I hadn't mentioned it to Darlene. I mentioned it to James, privately, and he was proud. He hugged Priya for about a full minute when she found out. That night, after Priya was in bed, Darlene called. She told James that Priya was too young, that the pressure would damage her, that this was exactly the kind of decision that showed I didn't understand what was best for a child in this family. I heard his half of the conversation from the hallway. He told her it was decided. She told him he was being led. I heard that part clearly. He was being led. By me. His wife. Priya's mother. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, and I stood there for a moment, very still. People like Darlene only felt in control when someone else felt small. I had stopped feeling small approximately 2 years ago. I didn't say anything to James that night, but the next morning I called Carol Nguyen. Carol was the family law attorney I had first consulted 8 months earlier, not for anything dramatic, just to understand where I stood on a few things. Sole custody documentation. James's adoption of Priya and what that meant for any third-party interference with her activities. Medical decision-making authority. Educational authority. Whether anyone outside of James and me had any legal standing to make decisions about Priya's schedule, her training, her registration in any competition. Carol had been very clear. The answer was no. Nobody. Not grandparents. Not extended family. Not anyone who was not a legal guardian. I had that consultation on file. I had Carol's direct number saved. The morning of the trials, Darlene must have decided that none of that mattered. But that call to Carol the month before, that was the thing Darlene never knew I had made. And by the time those shaking hands reached for that front desk, I already knew exactly what was about to happen next. The month before the trials, I had met with Carol Nguyen for the second time. Carol had a small office in a building near the county courthouse, 2nd floor, window facing the parking lot, a ficus in the corner that was clearly surviving on determination alone. She had reviewed everything I brought her, the original custody order, James's adoption paperwork for Priya, and a set of questions I had written out the night before on a legal pad. I sat across from her, and she went through each page without rushing, the way people do when they have read thousands of documents and have learned that speed is not the same as thoroughness. When she looked up, she said, in that calm, flat way of hers, "You have everything you need. What you're asking me to build is a perimeter." I told her that was exactly the right word for it. What Carol was drafting, and had been drafting since my first consultation 8 months earlier, was a formal set of legal notifications. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A documented record of sole guardianship authority, combined with a cease and desist framework that could be activated if anyone outside of the legally recognized guardians attempted to interfere with Priya's medical care, educational enrollment, or registered participation in competitive activities. Carol had explained it to me plainly, The document itself did not have to be filed to have power. The power was in the preparation. The moment it was needed, it could move. I had not told James about the cease and desist framework specifically. He knew I had consulted Carol. I had been transparent about that much. What I had not told him was how far I had taken it, or that it was sitting in a folder on Carol's desk ready. I had reasons for keeping that specific part quiet, and they were not complicated. James loved his mother. He was not a weak man, but he had 38 years of conditioning that told him Darlene's behavior was just how she was, just how she had always been, and that the right response was patience. I did not want to force him into a choice before the moment required it. That moment was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a weather shift, not dramatically, just as a fact. The training fund I had set up for Priya, the dedicated account in my name at my bank, had been growing quietly for almost 2 years. It had started as a practical decision. Gymnastics at the competitive level is not inexpensive. Club fees, coaching, competition registration, travel, equipment, the leotards that Priya treated like they were made of something sacred. I wanted a fund that was separate from our joint household account, ring-fenced and untouchable, so that no shift in our family finances could interrupt her training. By the time of the state trials, that account held a little over $14,000. I had never mentioned the specific balance to anyone except my accountant, a woman named Gloria Park who managed my personal finances and had been with me since before my first marriage. Nobody in James's family knew that account existed. That was the first close call. It happened about 6 weeks before the trials, at a Sunday dinner at Darlene's house. Her other son, James's younger brother Troy, had made some comment about gymnastics equipment being expensive. I think Priya had mentioned needing new grips, and Darlene had turned to me with that particular look she used when she was about to say something designed to sound helpful. "You know," she said, "if money is a concern, there are recreational programs at the community center. Very reasonable fees." She said it with her chin slightly lifted, the way she did when she had decided she was being generous. I looked at her for a moment. "We're fine," I said. "Priya's covered." Troy's wife, Sandra, who generally tried to stay out of things, said, "Oh, does James's company have some kind of athletic benefit?" I didn't know that. Her voice had a genuine curiosity to it. She wasn't probing, she was just making conversation. But the question was sitting right at the edge of exactly what I didn't want to discuss at that table. I said, pleasantly, "Just good budgeting," and reached across to pass the salad. James, across the table, met my eyes for exactly 1 second. He knew what I hadn't said. He picked up his fork and said something to Troy about work, and the moment passed. What had almost surfaced was not just the training fund. Gloria and I had also been quietly redirecting a portion of my income into a broader savings structure. A combination of a 529 account for Priya's future education and a separate investment account I had opened in my own name 3 years earlier, before James and I were even engaged. It had started small. By that Sunday dinner, between both accounts, I had built something that was approaching $60,000. Not dramatic by some standards. Enormous by mine, given where I had started. If that number had entered the conversation at Darlene's dining room table, I knew exactly what would have happened. She would have told James. James would have felt, not betrayed, but surprised in a way that would have required a long conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. And Darlene would have found a way to use it. I didn't know how yet, but I knew she would find a way. I had come that close to losing everything I had built. The next morning I called Gloria and told her to move up the transfer schedule we had discussed. She said she would have everything consolidated and documented within 10 days. I thanked her and hung up and sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for about 2 minutes before going in to start my shift. I had 3 days before Priya's final pretrial evaluation at the gym. That was about to matter more than I knew. The second close call came from a direction I hadn't expected, which is always the way it works. James's aunt, a woman named Beverly Osei who had a talent for being present at inconvenient moments, had called the house on a Thursday evening about 2 weeks before the trials. James had answered. I was in the next room helping Priya with a school project. She was making a diagram of the solar system and had very strong opinions about how large Saturn's rings should be, and I could hear James's half of the conversation without trying to. Most of it was unremarkable. Then I heard him say, "No, Renata handles her own finances separately. That's just how we..." And then a pause, and then, quieter, "I don't really know the details, Bev." I set down the ruler I was holding. After he hung up, he came into the kitchen where I was and leaned against the counter. His expression was not suspicious. It was something closer to mildly uncomfortable. "Bev was asking if we'd thought about setting up a family account for Priya's gymnastics stuff," he said. "She said Mom mentioned it." I looked at him. "Your mother mentioned it. Apparently she thinks it would be more organized." He made a face that told me he knew exactly how this sounded. His hand moved to the back of his neck. He did that when he was being asked to be in the middle of something he hadn't chosen. "I told her you handle it," he said. "I don't actually know what accounts you have, come to think of it." I said, carefully, "I have what I need, and Priya has what she needs. Is that a problem?" He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said. "No, it's not." And he went back to the living room. I stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. I was not angry at James. He had answered the question honestly, and he had not pushed. But the pattern was becoming clear. Darlene was working the edges. She was asking questions through relatives, building a picture, trying to understand what I had and whether she could get to it. She couldn't. None of it was accessible to her legally or practically. But the fact that she was probing meant she had already decided something needed to happen before those trials. I texted Carol that night. "Just check your calendar for next week, I need 30 minutes. She replied the next morning with a time. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already moved. The morning of the pretrial evaluation, Coach Denise pulled me aside after Priya's session. Denise was a compact, unhurried woman in her early 50s, 23 years of coaching behind her, the kind of person who said exactly what she meant without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be. She stood next to me by the bleachers and said, "She nailed the floor sequence. The judges at trials are going to notice her." Then she paused. "Is everything okay on your end? No obstacles?" I told her we were fine. She held my gaze for a second, nodded once, and went back to her next session. That was the moment I realized Carol needed to have the cease and desist framework finalized before the morning of the trials. Not after. Before. I called her on the drive home. She said she could have it ready by end of the following week. I told her I needed it by Wednesday. She said, "That changes the rate." I said I understood. She said she'd make it happen. I had 9 days left. And then Darlene hosted a family dinner and made the announcement that changed everything. It was a Saturday evening. Priya was at my friend Josephine's house. I had arranged that before any of this started, making sure she was nowhere near Darlene's dinner table that night, because I had felt something coming all week in the particular way that Darlene had gone quiet, which was always more dangerous than when she was loud. James and I drove over together. Troy and Sandra were already there. Beverly was there. And Darlene's closest friend, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had no business being at a family dinner except that Darlene liked having witnesses when she said difficult things. The first 40 minutes were exactly what family dinners at Darlene's always were. Troy talked about a renovation project. Sandra mentioned a trip they were planning. Beverly asked about James's work. Ruth complimented the centerpiece. Darlene moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the focused energy of a person who has something prepared and is waiting for the right moment to deliver it. I ate and said what was required and watched. The moment came between the main course and dessert. Darlene sat down fully for the first time all evening, smoothed her napkin, and said, with that pleasant, reasonable tone that I had learned to treat as a warning, "I've been thinking about Priya and the trials." James set his fork down. Not slowly, not dramatically, just set it down. I said nothing. "I spoke with someone at the gymnastics center," Darlene continued. She glanced at Ruth, which confirmed that Ruth was there to be a witness, not a guest. "The coordinator. Lovely woman. I just wanted to understand the process, what happens on the day, how these things are run." She paused. "I have some concerns about whether Priya is ready for this level of competition." Her voice had taken on something careful. I had heard that tone before. It was the tone of someone who had already done the thing they were about to announce they were only considering. I said, "What kind of concerns?" "She's 7. Darlene said it like it settled something. "The other children at this level will be older, more experienced. I don't want to see her humiliated in front of judges and a crowd. I don't want that for our family." Sandra, across the table, looked at her plate. Beverly looked at the centerpiece. Troy opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for his water glass. "Coach Webb submitted Priya for this evaluation," I said. "She has been coaching for 23 years. She assessed Priya's readiness, not mine, not yours, hers. The registration is paid. The recommendation is documented. This has been decided." Darlene's chin lifted. "I am simply expressing a concern as her grandmother." The word grandmother landed in a specific way. She knew what Priya called her. She knew what the adoption paperwork said. She was using the word deliberately, laying a claim through language that she could not lay through law. I looked at her across that table and something in me went very still. Not cold. Still. The difference matters. Cold is emotional. Still is something else. I had been carrying 14 months of this. The pancake breakfasts instead of practices, the salad bowl deflections, the Thursday evening phone calls. And I had been patient because patience was the right strategy, and I had known this moment was coming, and I had wanted to be prepared when it arrived. I was prepared. What I had not been prepared for was what she said next. "I've already spoken to the coordinator," she said. "I let her know that the family has reservations." I suggested that Priya's registration be reviewed. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. James turned to look at her. His hand had moved to the back of his neck. I kept my voice even. "You called the gymnastics center." "I made a phone call, yes. To discuss my daughter's registration." Darlene's hands, I noticed, were very still on the table. She was making them stay still. "I did what any grandmother would do," she said. Someone had to be realistic. There it was. The self-justification, spoken out loud, in front of witnesses. I stood up from the table. I did not push the chair back dramatically or raise my voice. I placed my napkin beside my plate, picked up my bag, and said to James, quietly, "I'm going to step outside for a minute." He looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between alarmed and understanding. I walked through Darlene's kitchen and out the side door into her driveway, and I stood there in the dark for approximately 90 seconds, and I breathed. Then I called Carol Gwynn. Her phone rang 4 times. She answered on the 5th, which meant she had seen my name and decided to pick up anyway. I said, "She contacted the gymnastics center. She tried to pull Priya's registration. I need the cease and desist finalized, and I need to know whether what she did qualifies as tortious interference with a registered minor's documented activity." Carol was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Send me the registration confirmation and the coaching recommendation tonight. I'll have the framework filed as a formal legal notification by Tuesday." I said, "What about the coordinator at the center? Does she need to receive anything?" Carol said, "I'll send a letter to the facility director directly. They need to know they are not authorized to remove a registered participant at the request of a non-guardian third party. That is as straightforward as it gets." I said, "Tuesday." Carol said, "Tuesday." I hung up. I stood in that driveway for another moment. The light from Darlene's kitchen window was falling across the concrete at an angle. Inside, through the glass, I could see James standing up from the table. He was talking to his mother, and his posture was different than it usually was when he talked to her, straighter, something tighter in his shoulders. I opened my email. I found the coaching recommendation letter and the registration confirmation. I forwarded both to Carol at 11:47 that night. There was no going back. James called twice on the drive home before I answered. When I picked up, he said, quietly, "Tell me what you need me to do." I told him. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "I should have done this a long time ago." I didn't tell him he was right, because this was not the moment to be right. I just said, "I need you to trust the process." He said he did. Priya was asleep when we got home. I went into her room and stood by the door for a moment. Her gymnastics bag was hanging on the hook by her closet. Her competition leotard was folded on the chair. She had laid it out herself, 2 days early, because she was 7 and she was ready. Darlene called 3 times the following morning. I let every call go to voicemail. Everything I needed to say, I would say once, in the lobby of that gymnastics center, with my daughter standing right beside me. The trials started at 9. I arrived at 8:15. The lobby of the Lakewood Gymnastics Center had that particular early morning stillness that big athletic spaces get before they fill up. The overhead lights were on full. The floor mat was visible through the double doors at the far end of the hall, and the folding tables near the entrance were being set up by 2 volunteers who were not yet fully awake. The coordinator, a woman named Angela Ferris, was standing behind the check-in desk with a clipboard and the look of someone who had already received one difficult phone call that morning and was hoping not to receive another. Priya was beside me, leotard on, wrist wrap in her right hand, her gymnastics bag on her left shoulder. She had been quiet in the car, not sad quiet, focused quiet. The kind of quiet that 7-year-olds get when they are taking something seriously and they know it. I had let her have it. I had seen Darlene the moment we walked in. She was standing near the far wall, not at the desk, not in the bleacher section near the wall, where she had a clear view of the entrance and of the coordinator's desk both. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and her good earrings. She had dressed for something. Beside her was Ruth Calloway, who had apparently decided that a 7-year-old's gymnastics trials was also her business. Ruth had her hands folded in front of her and was looking at the floor mat through the double doors with the focused expression of someone performing composure. When Darlene saw us come through the entrance doors, something happened in her face that she could not stop. Her chin dropped slightly. Her eyes moved from me to Priya and then back to me, and the calculation running behind her expression was visible in the way that things become visible when they are not going the way they were planned. She had made a phone call at 7:30 that morning. She had believed that call had settled something. We were here anyway. That gap between what she had expected and what she was looking at was doing something to her that her posture could not completely conceal. I looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then I looked at the coordinator. Angela Ferris had already seen us. She had the clipboard against her chest and her expression was careful in a specific professional way, the way people look when they are holding information they do not enjoy holding. I walked to the desk with Priya beside me, and I placed my phone on the counter with both documents open. Coach Denise Webb's written recommendation on the left, the paid registration confirmation on the right. I said, "My daughter is Priya Osei. She is registered for the 9 o'clock trials. I understand there may have been a communication this morning that created some confusion about her roster status. I'd like to speak with the head coach before this goes any further." Angela looked at my phone. She looked at me. She had the particular stillness of someone who has just understood that the situation they were handed 20 minutes ago is more complicated than it was presented to them. She said, "Let me get Coach Webb." I looked at the folder in my hands. I had waited a long time for this moment. Coach Denise Webb came out of the warm-up room 2 minutes later, still in her warm-up jacket, moving at the brisk pace of someone who has seen something unfair and is not interested in it continuing. She came through the double doors and crossed the floor, and she did not stop at the desk. She went directly to Priya, crouched to her level, and took her hand. She held it for a moment, and then she looked up at Priya's face and said, in the unhurried tone she used during corrections, "You are on that floor at 9 o'clock. Do you understand me?" Priya nodded, very seriously. Denise stood up. She looked at me and then she looked steadily, without any particular expression, at Darlene across the lobby. Darlene's hand moved to the wall beside her. Just briefly. Like she needed to find something solid. Denise turned back to Angela. Her voice was even. "Priya Osei is registered and she is competing. If anyone contacts this facility again requesting her removal, they are to be referred to me directly. Is that clear?" Angela said yes. Denise said, "Good." She went back through the double doors. The lobby had 4 other families in it, parents, a few siblings, a grandmother with a camera bag. They had all, without making it obvious, stopped what they were doing. The room had the quality of a space in which everyone is pretending not to have heard something while having heard all of it. I looked at Darlene. She was already looking at me. Her chin was lifted. Ruth had taken one small step away from her, not dramatically, just slightly, the way people do when they are recalculating whether they want to be standing next to someone. I said to Priya, without looking away from Darlene, "Go find Coach Webb. Tell her you're ready." Priya went through the double doors with her bag on her shoulder and her wrist wrap in her hand, and she did not look back, because she was 7 and she was focused, and she had a floor sequence to run. Then I walked toward my mother-in-law. I had a folder in my bag. It was a plain manila folder, not thick, 8 pages, printed that morning, organized in the sequence Carol and Gwyn and I had agreed on during a 40-minute phone call the previous evening. Carol was not present in the room, but her name was on every page. The facility director, a man named Howard Greer whom Denise had evidently already called, had come out of the back office and was standing near the check-in desk at a distance that was close enough to observe and far enough to claim he had been doing something else. There were witnesses. Not the witnesses Darlene had arranged, but the ones that circumstances had assembled. That would do. Ruth said, when I was 4 feet away, "I think we should all take a breath and..." I looked at her. I said, "I'm not speaking to you, Ruth." Ruth closed her mouth. Darlene's chin was still up. She said, in a controlled voice, "You're making a scene in front of families who are here for their children." Her voice had that careful quality, the one I had learned to treat as a warning. But it was doing something different now. The careful quality was working harder than usual. It was the tone of someone who had lost the position they had prepared for and was trying to sound like they hadn't. I said, "I am. And I want to make sure you understand exactly why." I opened the folder. The first document was the cease and desist notification that Carol had filed with the Gymnastics Center's facility director on Tuesday morning, 2 days before the trials. It was addressed to the facility and copied to Angela Ferris, Howard Greer, and the State Gymnastics Association's compliance coordinator. It stated, in plain legal language, that Priya Osei was a registered minor whose competitive activities were under the sole guardianship authority of her legal guardians, Renata Osei and James Osei, and that any attempt by a non-guardian third party to alter, remove, or otherwise interfere with her registered participation constituted tortious interference with the minor's documented educational and developmental activity and would be pursued accordingly. I held it out so Darlene could see the header. I did not hand it to her. I let her read it where it was. The pause was 2 seconds too long. She looked at the document. She looked at the header, Carol and Gwyn, Family Law, the filing date, Tuesday, which was 4 days ago. Her eyes moved across the first paragraph. I watched her process the specific words, sole guardianship authority, non-guardian third party, tortious interference, and I watched the sequence happen in her expression. First the attempt to read it quickly and dismiss it, then the moment when she understood it was real, then the stillness that came after. Ruth, beside her, said, "What is that?" Darlene said nothing. Her hand at her side was very still. She was making it stay still. I had seen her do that before at a dinner table when she had decided something needed to be controlled. I said, "This is the legal notification that was filed with this facility on Tuesday. Your phone call this morning was not only unauthorized, it was legally actionable. Carol and Gwyn is prepared to proceed." Darlene's voice came out different than she intended, slightly higher, the composure not quite holding its shape. "You had an attorney file a document about a gymnastics registration." "I had an attorney file a document about my daughter's rights," I said. "The gymnastics registration is one item on a longer list." That last sentence was deliberate. I had written it, approximately, during the phone call with Carol. I wanted her to hear the word longer and not know how long. She heard it. Something shifted in her expression, too fast to name, but I caught it. Howard Greer, near the desk, had straightened up without meaning to. Angela was holding her clipboard with both hands. I reached into the folder. The second document was the court-filed adoption order for Priya, James's legal adoption, completed 18 months after our wedding, citing Renata Osei and James Osei as sole legal guardians with full parental authority. It named the county, the judge, the date. It was not a new document. I had carried a copy in my files for over 2 years. But I had never placed it in front of Darlene before, and I placed it in front of her now, held flat in both hands, at eye level, so that the official court seal in the upper left corner was the first thing she saw. The color started leaving her face. She knew about the adoption. She had been at the dinner when James told the family. She had smiled and said it was wonderful. She had bought Priya a card. What she had apparently not fully absorbed, or had chosen not to fully absorb, was what the legal document behind it actually said, that the adoption extinguished every third-party claim, however informal, however family-adjacent, that anyone outside of Renata and James Osei had to any decision affecting Priya. Not advisory claims. Not grandmother claims. Every claim. Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word. Darlene said, her voice now doing the thing where it tries to be steady and isn't quite, I know about the adoption. I was there when. Then you know what this says, I said. She put her hand flat on the wall beside her. Just for a second. Then she moved it. From near the desk, I heard one of the other parents, a woman I didn't know, there with a daughter in a blue leotard, say, quietly, to the person beside her, something I couldn't fully hear. But I heard the tone. It was the tone of someone watching something and understanding which side of it they were on. I said, that was the second document. I have 3 more. Nobody spoke. For 3 full seconds, nothing. Then Darlene said, and her voice had lost almost all of its careful quality now, you are doing this here. In front of strangers. This is how you conduct yourself. Her breath had changed shorter, higher in her chest. I said, you conducted yourself by calling this facility at 7:30 this morning and attempting to remove a 7-year-old from a competition she trained for and is registered for and earned. You did that. I am responding to what you did. Ruth said, Darlene, I think we should. Darlene said, she will never speak to me this way. Her voice was tight now. Something in the structure of it was working very hard. I waited a beat. Then I said, I have been patient with you for 4 years. I have sat at your table and listened to you tell me my daughter's training was a waste of money. I have listened to you call gymnastics a cute hobby. I have let conversations pass that I should not have let pass because I was trying to keep this family functional. This morning you tried to pull my daughter's name from a roster she earned. You did not ask me. You did not ask James. You made a decision about my child and you acted on it unilaterally because you believed you could. Her hand moved, not to the wall this time, but to her collarbone. She reached for something at her neckline the way she did when she was backed into a corner. Her fingers closed on the chain of her necklace. I said, I need you to understand that you could not. That you cannot. And that this morning is the last time you will ever be in a position to try. I reached into the folder for the 3rd document. This one was different. It was a letter from Carol Nguyen, dated the previous Tuesday, addressed to Darlene Osei directly, sent to her home address, certified mail, signature required. The letter formally notified Darlene that any future contact with Priya's school, medical providers, athletic programs, or extracurricular organizations, made without the explicit written authorization of her legal guardians, would be pursued as a pattern of interference with the care and development of a minor under guardianship, and that documentation of each incident, going back 14 months, had been compiled and was held on file with Carol's office. I had 14 incidents. I had been counting. I said, you should have received this at home on Wednesday. Did you receive it? Something happened in Darlene's face. Not a collapse, not yet, but the loss of the last layer of composure she had been holding. The chin that had been up came slightly down. Her eyes moved from the document to me and then away, to a point somewhere between us that was neither of our faces. Ruth took a full step back. Howard Greer, near the desk, cleared his throat. He said, carefully, to Angela, in a voice that was clearly meant to be private, but was audible to everyone, I think we're done here. Angela nodded without looking up. Darlene said, you've been documenting. It was not a question. Her voice came out at half its usual volume. I said, since the first incident. 14 months ago. The Saturday morning when you took Priya to breakfast instead of practice and told James she had said she was tired. I paused. She was 5. You used a 5-year-old's trust to get what you wanted. I wrote it down that afternoon. I looked at her. I wrote all of them down. Her breath changed again. I reached into the folder for the fourth document, and I said, "There is one more thing I want you to understand today. Not because it changes anything legally, Carol has covered that already. But because I think you have been operating with a specific misunderstanding about where I stand, and I don't want there to be any confusion about it going forward." I had not planned to do this next part. It had not been in the folder when I printed it that morning. But I had been carrying the knowledge of it for 2 years, and standing in that lobby with my mother-in-law in front of me and witnesses present, I decided that the full picture deserved to be in the room. I said, "You told James, for months ago through Beverly, that you were concerned about whether Priya's training was financially sustainable. You implied, through Darlene, that I might need to reconsider the commitment." I kept my voice even, the way I keep it even when I am presenting billing discrepancies to hospital administrators, factual, unhurried, precise. "I want you to know that Priya's training account currently holds $14,200. I established it 2 years ago, in my name, at my bank, specifically so that no change in our household finances could interrupt her program. She is not at risk of losing her training. She has never been at risk of losing her training." I let that land. Then I said, "I also have a 529 education account in Priya's name with a current balance of $31,000 and a personal investment account that I opened before James and I were married, which is currently valued at just under $30,000. I said the numbers the same way I said everything else, not for drama, not for performance, but because they were facts relevant to the record, and the record deserved to be complete. I have a financial advisor named Gloria Park who manages both accounts. I have had her for 6 years. I looked at Darlene. I looked at her fully, the way you look at someone when you want them to understand that you are not performing, that you mean every word of what you are saying. I said, "You decided, at some point, that I was someone who needed to be managed. That my daughter needed to be protected from my decisions. That your family name required defending from whatever it was you thought I represented." My voice stayed level. "I want you to understand, clearly, that you made that determination about a woman who was managing her family's financial future and her daughter's legal protections while you were calling gymnastics coordinators at 7:30 in the morning. You thought you were intervening. You were not in a position to intervene. You were never in a position to intervene." The room was very quiet. Ruth was looking at the floor. Howard Greer had taken 2 steps toward the far side of the desk. He was facing away from us now, in the manner of a person who has decided that anything that happens in the next 60 seconds is not his business, and he would prefer the spatial distance to confirm that. One of the parents, the woman with the daughter in the blue leotard, had stopped pretending to look at her phone. She was looking at us. Her expression was not the expression of someone watching a conflict. It was the expression of someone watching something resolve. I looked at Darlene one more time. She was still. Not the controlled stillness she had performed all morning, the other kind, the kind that happens when the performance has run out of material. I said, "Carol Nguyen's office will be in contact about the formal documentation. You don't need to do anything except receive the paperwork. We're done here." I closed the folder. I put it back in my bag. And then I walked through the double doors to where my daughter was warming up. I found Priya at the far end of the warm-up floor, working through her floor sequence with Coach Denise standing 6 feet away, watching with her arms crossed, and that specific expression she had when something was going right, not approving, just observant, which was how Denise showed approval. Priya was moving through the sequence without hesitation. When she reached the end of it, she looked up and saw me, and her face did the thing it did, that uncomplicated, full-face thing that 7-year-olds do when they are not yet worried about whether joy looks appropriate. She said, "Did you see that?" I said, "I saw it." She said, "I didn't fall." I said, "You didn't fall." Denise looked at me over Priya's head. Her expression asked a question. I nodded once. She uncrossed her arms and said to Priya, again, "From the top." Priya went from the top. I sat on the bench along the wall and I set my bag on the floor and I put my hands in my lap. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere between the 3rd document and the 4th. I had not realized until that moment that they had been shaking. I let out a long breath, slowly, through my nose, the way you do when you have been holding something for a very long time, and the reason to hold it is finally, completely gone. Priya competed at 9 o'clock. She placed 4th out of 11 in her age group. Not first. Not a podium finish. 4th, with a floor sequence that Coach Denise said afterward was the cleanest she had run it in 6 months, and a score that qualified her for the regional invitational in the spring. She came off the floor with her chin up and her hands on her hips, looking for me in the bleachers, and when she found me she waved with her whole arm. I waved back with my whole arm. Darlene was not in the bleachers. She and Ruth had left the lobby before the trials began. I don't know exactly when they left. I didn't see them go. Carol and Gwyn filed the full formal notification package with the county family court the following Monday, a documented record of the 14 incidents, the unauthorized contact with the gymnastics facility, and the cease and desist framework, registered as a formal filing against interference with a minor's developmental activities by a non-guardian third party. It was not a criminal filing. What Darlene had done, Carol explained, was not a felony under the relevant statutes, it was civil tortious interference. And the filing created a legal record that would follow any future attempt she made to involve herself in Priya's registered programs, medical decisions, or educational arrangements. Any future incident would be immediately actionable, with the prior documented pattern as supporting evidence. I showed James the full filing on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table. He went through every page. He was quiet for a long time after, and then he said, 14. I said, yes. He set his hand flat on the table, the same gesture I had seen him make when he was working through something that required more than he had prepared for. He said, I'm sorry it took this long. I told him it didn't require an apology. It required going forward differently. He said he understood. He called his mother the following week. I was not in the room. I don't know exactly what was said. What I know is that from that day forward, Darlene Osei did not contact Priya's school, her medical providers, her gymnastics club, or any of her programs. Not once. Carol received no further incidents to document. The consequences for Darlene were not dramatic in the way that public consequences sometimes are. They were daily life level, which is the kind that actually matters. James's relationship with her changed in a way that could not be fully walked back, not severed, but recalibrated, with a new and explicit perimeter that had not previously existed. Troy and Sandra, who had been at that dinner and had heard what she said about someone having to be realistic, had their own recalibration to make. Sandra called me about 3 weeks after the trials. She said, I should have said something at dinner. I want you to know I knew that even then. I told her I appreciated it. Beverly stopped calling altogether, which was its own kind of clarity. Darlene sold her house 8 months after the trials and moved into a smaller place about 40 minutes outside of the city. I don't know if the two things were related. Ruth Calloway, based on what Sandra told me, stopped being a regular presence. The social structure that Darlene had maintained for years, the Sunday dinners, the family adjacencies, the arrangement by which her position at the center of things had been treated as a given, did not survive the rebalancing intact. She had built that structure on the assumption that nobody would push back. Someone had pushed back. The structure was not designed for that. Gloria Park restructured both of Priya's accounts in the spring, the 529 education account and the training fund, consolidating them under a single management framework with better return projections. The training fund is now specifically earmarked for competition costs through Priya's secondary school years. The education account is growing on schedule. These are not dramatic numbers. They're the numbers of someone who started planning early and did not stop. Priya competed at the Regional Invitational in April. She placed 2nd. She came off the floor and found me in the crowd and held up 2 fingers, then thought about it and held up 1 finger on the other hand and did the arithmetic out loud. 2 means I almost won. I told her that was one way to look at it. She said, what's the other way? I said 2nd means you're coming back. She decided she liked that better. Coach Denise, on the drive home, sent me a text that said simply, spring camp starts in June. Bring her ready. I keep that text. Not for any particular reason. just because it is the kind of sentence that tells you, cleanly, that the right people are in the right places and the path ahead is clear. I don't hate Darlene. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easier to say I do, and it would probably make for a more satisfying ending. But the truth is that what I feel when I think about her now is something closer to distance, the way you feel about a weather system that caused a lot of damage and then moved on. She wanted to be the person who decided things. She needed someone in this family to need her authority. She chose to aim that need at my daughter. That was her mistake. I had been building the answer to it for 14 months before she ever picked up a phone. What I actually feel, when I am sitting on the bleachers watching Priya run her floor sequence for the 47th time with the same focus she had at 5 years old, the same fierce joy, is that we are exactly where we are supposed to be. That is enough. That has always been enough. So, did I go too far, or did I not go far enough? I want to know what you think in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, there's more where this came from.